NZBC TV, to its everlasting credit, used to run lengthy, from memory, there were about 3 months, 12 to 15 weeks, production training courses. There were only two organisations that did it, as far as I was aware, NZBC TV and BBC. It was an excellent course, and you really got exposure to everything. Though for one of my major exercises, I did literally get a cameraman who was blind in one eye and a deaf sound recordist. Literally true. They're well known to anybody who was around at that time. And Roy Melford, who was running the course, said, look, he said, I'm not sure which was the most incompetent, the cameraman, the sound recordist, or you, but somehow he passed me. I used to proudly tell people we were the #1 show in the ratings, which was true, but we were the only network and we were the only local show. But anyway, but we were #1. And that's where I started working with Brian Edwards. The programme was in a very sorry state. And I remember walking in on the Easter Monday to an empty office, and the first show was the following night that I was going to do. And the only thing in the can was a 1 minute 42-second filler with Brian Edwards in a rowboat in Hadley Park, in the lake at Hadley Park, to the song "The Little Red Rented Rowboat," and that was it. Other than that, the larder was bare, and we were going out the following night. You know. Anyway, so that was a baptism of fire, but hugely enjoyed it. Learned an enormous amount of working with the team and dealing with the politics of the local community and all the rest of it. It was a wonderful experience. I think I really feel sad for people in this era of over-specialisation that you don't get that breadth of experience that we were lucky enough to have at that time. Compass was the bee's knees in those days. Ian Johnson was the big star. And I brought Brian up a short time later. And we then sat on our backsides for 6 months because they didn't have any money to make the show. The budget had run out. So we literally used to be in the office all day doing nothing for 6 months. We became very adept at pool. We used to go across to the pool hall in Courtney Place and play there all the time. We finally got going with Compass, and we had some very successful shows. I persuaded them that we needed something much more topical with much more edge, and they rather stupidly said yes, and that's how we started Gallery. And luckily, we were young enough and green enough not to understand, or not to fully understand, the extraordinary power we had, because we were the only current affairs show on the only television network in a country that didn't have a national press. So we could literally change government policy overnight. And luckily, we didn't have any political agenda, and we didn't have any real grasp of how unique our position was, because it's terrifying looking back that it was permitted to happen. I mean, I just don't know how it happened. And I talk to people about it, friends around the world, you know, in current affairs and news and journalists and they say, it can't be true. And I said, I promise you, it was literally true. I put 2 teams in the field to research the story, one from the Post Office Union side and one from the government side. The government was a particularly lacklustre government at that time. I mean, they were the collective cabinet IQ would hardly reach room temperature. I was sitting in Waring Taylor Street in my office. I can remember it to this day. The 2 teams are sitting there. And the first one reports, I think Darren Shanahan was the lead researcher on it. They reported back and they said, this is the post office workers' position. So I turned to whoever, I think it was Jeff Walker, who's now the managing director of Penguin. And I said, and what's the government's position? And he said exactly the same. It was literally the same, point for point. But they hadn't spoken to each other for 3 weeks. They'd each got themselves to a position where they were ready to agree, but they'd missed one small point. They hadn't spoken. And the country was grinding to a halt. Because it's long before email, you know, mobile phones and rest, we were totally dependent on post. And the country was literally grinding to a halt. I mean, it was quite extraordinary, the impact. That's why it was such a big story. And we put the idiot minister and the equally stupid union bloke in the studio. We did the film report, and at the end of the film report, I had Brian say to the two of them, said, well, gentlemen, as far as we can see, you have the same position. And within, I think it was 10 minutes, they agreed they did have the same position, right? And it was all finished. In a way, a lot of the success we had was an indictment on the print media in New Zealand at the time. It was incredibly parochial. It was extraordinarily fat and lazy. They made so much money from, what do you call it, the small ads, that, you know, they literally were asleep. I mean, we broke story after story, and this wasn't great journalism. It was just we got off our backsides, you know, and they didn't. You know. He was a delight to work with, except we couldn't get him into the studio. I mean, he was a bugger for keeping people away. He'd sit in makeup for, you know, 45 minutes after the audience was, everything was ready, you know. And it was just, I don't know what it was, just a power trip or something. The standout for me was Keith Park and Charles Upham. Keith Park was the New Zealander who was in charge of the Battle of Britain. David said to him, Sir Keith, when did you know you might win the Battle of Britain? And he said, and he's ramrod straight, very slim man, ramrod straight. He said, Mr. Frost, I got into my personal hurricane and I flew myself down the Thames. And this is exactly what it is, he said. And as I got to Tower Bridge, I looked out and I tilted the aircraft and I could see the fires down the East End of London. And as I saw those poor people's homes burning, I knew we would win, because we had diverted them from our airstrips. And our problem was not lack of aircraft. Our problem was that they were destroying our airstrips. And honestly, you could have heard a pin drop in the studio. It was so impressive. I was asked by NZBC what would I like to do, which was very generous of them. I put my hand up to take over sport, because sport at that time was run by radio. Ran sport under Lance Cross. And so I put my hand up for that, and much to Lance's anger, it was separated out, and I set up television sports, and it was moribund, you know. Their idea of journalism was to go out to say to a sportsman they admired, tell me why you're so wonderful. This was hard-hitting sports journalism. And so we completely revolutionised things, and that was great fun. Perhaps went a bit too far. We did one thing I'm embarrassed about to this day. I introduced a programme called This Sporting Life, which was a magazine sports programme on a Wednesday night. And I had Bill McCarthy one night. I wrote an intro for Bill. Poor Bill, he had the courage or stupidity to read it on camera. It said, tonight we look at a second-class sport for second-class people. Pause. Well, that's what their critics would say. And then we looked at rugby league. The switchboard melted down. But I promise you, that was the prevailing attitude to rugby league at that time. But, you know, I just have this Irish need to stir things up. The great thing about New Zealand television is how much is achieved in a country of less than 5 million. I mean, I think it's remarkable how much is achieved. I personally would wish for less emphasis on commercialisation and a little more breadth of programming. But I think the government and the Treasury are to blame for that. I mean, this utter obscenity of a public service television operation having to pay a dividend to the government, I mean, I think is so wrong-headed as to be laughable, you know. I think I'm extraordinarily fortunate to have had that grounding in New Zealand across a whole areas of the industry. I mean, today people specialise so quickly and so narrowly. I mean, I did everything from quite literally sweeping the studio floor to holding hot press captions on a stand on top of a tower at Lancaster Park on a freezing August day in a rugby test match, and at the end of which the wind is blowing a gale, and I have to pull my arm down. It's frozen, you know. And you know, I did current affairs, I did drama, I did religious programs, I did rural programs. I mean, that was an extraordinary grounding, and it's so helpful in this industry, which, as I say, becomes so narrow and so increasingly specialised.